All right, greetings, friends, and welcome. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast here this week. We begin, as you might expect, with the latest in the ongoing trade drama between Canada and the United States and the latest escalation under U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, it's a 30-day window before these tariffs take effect, but the U.S. has announced new tariffs, 50% tariffs, to be imposed on certain Canadian goods. And what's also worrying about this latest development is that there are no CUSMA exemptions under our existing trade agreement with the United States, an agreement that, of course, we negotiated with Donald Trump himself in his first term as president. So it's a little worrying that we're going down this path. I think it's also worrying in the sense that if we can somehow get a new deal with the US, how much faith can we put in that? How much faith can we put in Donald Trump not to violate that agreement? It was interesting because the announcement of these latest tariffs, and by the way, Donald Trump has been throwing around all kinds of tariffs this week, imposing new tariffs on a total of 60 countries under the justification of trying to crack down on forced labor. These tariffs on Canada fall under the 1930 U.S. Tariff Act, also known as the Smoot-Hawley Act, if you recall that opening scene in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So there might be some shaky legal ground for all of this. Trump seems to be searching for, grasping for justifications. But look, I mean, this is potentially very serious. And these latest tariffs that were announced against Canada came just a couple of days after Trump was threatening to tariff Canada over wildfire smoke that was blowing from Canada into the United States. On Monday, he was asked whether these tariffs are in response to that wildfire smoke, or maybe there's still another shoe to drop.
Canada tariffs. One, are those a response to the wildfires in?
No. That's separate. We're looking at that separately.
And what is there anything Canada
It's only
can do?
response to the way they've treated our farmers and our people. You know, Canada's been very, very tough on us over the years, for many years, and no other president's done anything about it. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. Many friends that live in Canada, but their leadership, from Trudeau to the current leadership. I mean, in all fairness to them, they need us to survive. Without us, there's no way they can survive. So, but they've been very, very tough over a period of the last 50 years, actually.
So who knows what might come next or what the actual justification for all of this is. I think clearly, more broadly, the U.S. really just wants to have it both ways. They want tariffs to keep imports out of their country, but they don't want other countries putting any trade barriers in place. They want to be able to get U.S. goods into other markets. The idea that it's a privilege to deal with them, and so you accept a trade agreement on their terms, in terms that will be favorable to them. And I think that's kind of where we're at here. But this was weird. This was an interview with Trump trade advisor Peter Navarro, who is trying to make it seem like Canadians are just lunatics when it comes to free trade, that we're screwing the Americans left and right over all kinds of different issues.
Now, Canada, going back to the first term, yep, Chris, when Donald Trump got elected in 2016, Wilbur Ross and I were designated as the guys that started negotiating with Canada before we got the trade representative. Yep. And I can tell you that of all the people that I've dealt with on trade, Canada, love the people, but their negotiators, some of the most dishonest people I've ever met. They stab you in the back. And what they're doing with this particular set of tariffs is they have these enormous dairy tariffs, like triple-digit dairy tariffs. They refuse to back down on. They're screwing us in terms of hard alcohol. We have good alcohol distillers. And they're screwing us on auto parts, and they're doing it in a discriminatory way, which is why we're using this thing called 338, to the point where they're doing stuff to us at the same time that they're inviting the Europeans in wide open to their market. So the president says, no, this is not cutting it.
So look, the justification for these tariffs under the U.S. Tariff Act is that Canada is discriminating against the United States. So I guess he kind of has to portray it that way. But look, I mean, let's be real here. Everything that he describes in terms of what Canada has done in terms of tariffs or the booze ban or the boycott of U.S. alcohol was in response to what the U.S. did last year. The U.S. imposed tariffs. We responded with counter tariffs. Now the US is trying to claim that those counter tariffs are discriminatory, so they're imposing new tariffs. And I guess if we retaliate, they'll say that that's unfair. So it's fair and just from their perspective to impose tariffs, but it's unfair and discriminatory when Canada or other countries respond in kind. And that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in here. Now, the point about supply management is interesting. I think this is a weird protectionist hang up on Canada's part. I think the US and other trading partners have legitimate complaints about supply management and how we regulate and protect the dairy and poultry sector. But again, there are provisions under the existing trade agreement with the United States regarding all of this. And maybe the US would like that to be more favorable. But Canada is not violating that trade agreement. We're adhering to what was agreed to under CUSMA as far as it pertains to that sector. So yeah, if there are negotiations happening, if the U.S. wants that to change, then maybe we can sit down and have that conversation. I think Canadians would benefit, honestly, from some changes in supply management and how that protectionism raises costs for Canadian consumers. And that's maybe the broader point here is that tariffs and retaliatory tariffs do harm the economy, do harm consumers, right? U.S. tariffs are driving up costs for Americans. I think there's growing frustration and opposition to tariffs in the U.S., which is encouraging. It's part of the point that Canadian leaders have made. By the same token, then we need to be careful about what we're imposing on Canadian consumers and the Canadian economy in terms of a response. Now, the idea of a Canadian response was, of course, front and center this week in Prince Edward Island as the Prime Minister, the Premier, the First Ministers gathered to talk about all of this and what, if anything, to do in response. And because these tariffs haven't kicked in, the Canadian government is not announcing any plans to respond or retaliate. That seems to be on the table, though. Here's what the Prime Minister said in his statement at the close of that gathering.
As everyone knows, on Monday, the U.S. administration announced its intention to impose the latest in a series of unilateral and unwarranted trade actions. Let's be clear about how Canada is responding. Yes, we are intensifying our negotiations with the United States in pursuit of a comprehensive agreement that addresses all tariff-related sectors. In all circumstances, irrespective of the outcome of those negotiations, Canada will do whatever it takes to build our strength at home and to support Canadian families, workers, our farmers, our businesses. We're ready. We're ready because we have been focusing on what we can control. And that's building our strength at home, buying Canadian, backing Canadian workers, building Canadians. That's the resolve of Canadians. That's the foundation on which we're building. We're a reliable partner in a world that's anything but. So we're diversifying our partnerships abroad. The First Ministers at this table have been central to that effort. Provincial premiers have led more than 50 trade missions since we last met in person in January, and over 130 since I became Prime Minister. Our government, the federal government, has signed more than 20 new economic and security partnerships because Canada has what the world wants, and Canada believes in the benefits of free and fair trade. We're also ready because of what we know in our bones, that our unity is our greatest strength and our destiny is in our hands.
Well, for more now on the latest Trump tariffs, the escalation in the trade war, and where all of this goes from here, we're very pleased to once again be joined by David Clement. He is Policy Director of the Consumer Choice Center, much more consumerchoicecenter.org. David, great to have you back with us here.
Thank you, Rob. It's always a pleasure.
Let's start with, first of all, how bad this is right now. I mean, these are steep tariffs. There's no CUSMA exemptions, which is worrying. They are, though, somewhat limited in scope. There's a bit of a deadline still before this all comes into effect.
Yep.
Maybe there's some legal or political pushback south of the border. Your assessment of where we're at here?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not great, but the 50% headline is scarier than the actual reality of what it impacts. So it's about it would impact about 5% of our exports to the United States. Now, it is really important to highlight here that it depends on where you live, because the impact varies based on region. Like the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, it's about 1% of their exports would be impacted to the US. In BC, I think it's closer to 13%. In Quebec, it's around 10. BC is especially problematic because of the lumber, paper mills, everything in the forestry sector could take a pretty serious hit. And obviously, the US is the biggest market. So it's on a macro scale, Canadian economy, total export lens. It's obviously not great, but it's not as scary as the headline would suggest. But if you're working in forestry in BC, or you're in a sector in Quebec that's already impacted by steel and aluminum tariffs, and this is further complicating supply chains, it's a different game depending on where you live.
We already seem to be in a bit of a retaliatory cycle. I mean, going back to last year, Trump imposed these new tariffs. Canada retaliated with counter tariffs. Now, here we are today. The US is claiming those counter tariffs warrant some retaliation. And once again, Canada is considering some further retaliation. So we may yet see some escalation in all of this. What worries you about that?
Well, so what worries me is everyone has become a hypocrite in the trade war. So, one, nobody wins a trade war. You're just making yourself poorer. But two, everyone has become a hypocrite. And so, starting with the Trump administration, obviously, this was a trade war that they started. Not saying that we shouldn't retaliate doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge the truth of where this all began. It began with the decision of Donald Trump. But the Trump administration is incredibly hypocritical because they're telling an American audience that tariffs are economically sound policy and they're going to revive American businesses and American manufacturing, and then looking across the border and complaining about tariffs from Canada. But on the flip side, we have our politicians who are going on CNN and Fox and major US networks talking about how when a country enacts tariffs, it's a tax on their own consumers, it's economically ruinous, which is, of course, true. But that same cohort of people are now lining up and trying to urge the prime minister to retaliate with tariffs of our own, which would just be taxing Canadian consumers. And so, I mean, I've been getting into this online with all sorts of people who think we have to retaliate. And I mean, if Trump is going to keep hitting his economy with a stick and potentially lighting it on fire, our response shouldn't be to hit our economy with a stick and light it on fire. In fact, it should be more of what we've seen as of Friday morning is a new trade deal with Ecuador. And yes, that's small peanuts in comparison to the United States, but it's progress. This is good. We're starting to have the conversation about what more liberalized and open trade can look like with other partners potentially. Retaliating just further insulates us and adds fuel to the fire in terms of the existing cost of living crisis, and ultimately just makes Canadians poorer. And I don't think that we're better off. It might make us feel better if we retaliate, but that emotional drive comes with the consequence of making Canadians poorer. And
Mm.
I don't think we should be lining up to advocate for policies that make our fellow citizens worse off.
Well, and maybe that gets to sometimes, I think, a misunderstanding around what tariffs are. And Trump
Mhm.
himself seems to be one of the chief culprits. I mean, when he was threatening Canada over wildfire smoke, he was talking about more tariffs and how Canada has to pay. And he often does this where, he describes a tariff as Canada's paying tariffs or other countries are sending money somehow into the United States. And maybe we fall into that a little bit here. Essentially, a tariff is an import tax. If anybody's paying the tariff, it's importers, whether it's American importers on US tariffs, right? Canadian importers on Canadian tariffs. That's how these things work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean the pass-through rate, which is the rate in which the tariff is ultimately shouldered by the domestic consumer, it does vary from industry to industry. But generally speaking, if you look at the analysis from the Tax Foundation in the US, it's in the high 90% range. And so it is predominantly shouldered by American consumers. And that economic reality doesn't magically change when we cross the border. It's still true. And so for anyone who's lining up to advocate for retaliatory tariffs, you can't have it both ways, where tariffs are a tax and economically ruinous when Trump does it, and tariffs are magically beneficial and good when, let's say, our federal government does it.
Yeah. Well, as you alluded to, I mean, it's not about sitting around and doing nothing. I think there's certainly more Canada can do. We get into on the interprovincial trade side,
Hmm.
building new trade relationships, making ourselves more resilient. It's not doing nothing.
Yep.
What about the strategic argument, though, that I'm sure you heard that yes, if we retaliate, sure, there's a cost, but if that gets the Americans' attention or that gets us to the table, that maybe some longer term good somehow comes from that.
My argument would be, did it work? Did it
Hmm.
work that we took American alcohol off the shelf? Like, did it work that premiers overstepped their jurisdiction and weaponized their provincial liquor boards that shouldn't exist to ban US alcohol? Did that get us closer to a deal? No, it did not. And so I don't think that I don't think that the idea that playing tough is going to get us across the line. I think actually having a diversified trade strategy where we start to look elsewhere, we start to build the infrastructure that even makes that possible, right? If we look at oil and gas, there are, for the first time in 12 years, we're actually having a serious conversation about what does it look like to get Alberta oil and gas west? What does it look like to get it east? And east not routed through the United States. So the conversations are happening, which is great. Now, those projects take a long time to complete. None of that would be built prior to the end of the Trump administration. But what I would say to Canadians is the Trump administration is basically throwing anything at the wall and seeing what can stick. Right? It was the national security justification.
Right.
They've dusted off a provision from that hasn't been used since the 1940s, which would still probably face a legal challenge. Now we're talking about forced labor tariffs, conveniently as previous tariffs expire or are undercut by the courts.
Yeah.
But I would say let's take a deep breath, because the US courts can continue to undermine the tariff authority of the president. There is legislation in the House in front of Congress right now to do exactly that and to pull the tariff authority away from the president, which is the historical norm. The Republicans could lose the House and the Senate in just a few months. What does that look like if they lose it? Do the Democrats fully enact removing tariff power from the president, and then this is more or less over? And what happens in the next presidential election? If it's, let's say, Gavin Newsom or Josh Shapiro or Rahm Emanuel on the Democratic ticket, and they win, does the Canada-U.S. trade relationship normalize and go back to normal? And then even on the Republican side, if it's Marco Rubio, anyone who knows Rubio's history is most of this tariff stuff is completely outside of his traditional worldview. If it's Marco Rubio, is there an argument that our trade relationship goes back to normal? I think there is. And so there are all these things that could happen, some in a matter of weeks, some in a matter of months, some in a matter of just a couple of years. And so I don't think solidifying, increasing the cost of goods for Canadian consumers is a great approach, given that there are so many chances for this to fall apart between now and the next presidential election.
Yeah. It's interesting, as you allude to. I mean, that there is much more of a consensus now that free trade is good, open markets are good, protectionism is bad, but we've got a lot of weird protectionism still in Canada. I
Yeah.
mean, the Americans certainly do themselves. But one of the obvious ones here is supply management. This whole regime we have around the dairy industry, in terms of limiting the participants, having quotas, setting
Mhm.
prices, having massive tariffs. The Americans kind of have a point about some of this. Now, we did make some agreements around all of this in Kuzma that we are sticking to, but what do you make of just our continued hang up on supply management, and why it's once again an obstacle to getting a free trade deal?
Well, it's so weird to see Canadians be so anti-Trump, which I understand the sentiment, right?
Mhm.
To be so anti-Trump and criticize his views on trade and then justify supply management, which on its face is a very Trumpy policy, right? It's a very Trumpy policy. It's huge tariffs to protect the domestic industry, ranging from 150 to 300%. So how are we defending this while also ridiculing tariffs from south of the border that are a fraction of that overall percentage? Um, I can't understand why we still justify this in the context of we should get rid of it for our own good. We should get
Right.
rid of it for our own good because it drastically inflates the cost of milk, cheese, chicken, turkey, eggs. These are fundamental core food staples. Why on earth are we defending a policy that inflates the prices of those goods while we're still on the heels of a cost of living crisis, while we still have record numbers of Canadians going to food banks? Not a great policy to continue to defend when you consider the domestic chaos that has been, let's say, the last 5 years in terms of food inflation outpacing everything else. So my argument would be we should get rid of it for its own good, for our own good. However, I understand the sentiment that we don't want to give Trump a win, right? Let's not cave on supply management and give Trump a win. Fine, I get it. However, we want to diversify our trade around the world. The European Union, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. What has been their number one grievance with Canada in potential trade talks? It's been supply management. It's the reason why the terms of CETA were so slow to enact. It's the reason why not all European countries have ratified the deal. Um, So we have to address the elephant in the room, whether or not we're going to reintegrate with the United States or if we're going to look abroad, because it's a problem for all of our potential trade partners for more liberalized and freer trade. I mean, even the OECD itself has criticized our system of supply management.
Yeah.
And so for me, we are going to have to address this at some point, either for our own good, just having a domestic national conversation about it, or we're going to have to address it to try and figure out something with the Americans. And if we don't figure out something with the Americans, we're going to have to address it to try and be at the table with other countries who we want to trade with.
Right. I think it's also about listening to the rest of the ag sector. I mean, it's kind of funny how these latest US tariffs target Canadian dairy as though we're really interested in exports, but the rest of the ag sector very much is, right? Think how determined we were to get China to lift those tariffs on Canadian
Yep,
agriculture, even going back how devastating it was when other countries blocked Canadian beef and how long it took
yep,
to recover from that. The rest of the ag industry benefits from free trade, and yet we're
yes.
sacrificing all of that potentially to protect this one little segment of the ag industry. It's very strange.
It is very strange. And what I see all the time is people will say, well, if we open it up to the Americans, well, then they're going to overtake the market, right? We're just going to be flooded with American product and our dairy farms will fail. Interesting concern. If it were true, which it is not, I could potentially understand it. But it didn't happen in anything else,
Right.
right? Didn't happen with American beef. American beef doesn't dominate Canadian shelves. It doesn't happen in vegetables where we grow our own depending on the season and they also grow. It doesn't happen in pork. Um, where we have liberalized trade, the Canadian industry has largely been able to stand on its own 2 feet and, most importantly, become an exporter. And this is really where it matters, is because with the rising tide of globalization, right, the world middle class is growing. It's getting bigger. And as people are lifted out of poverty, the demand for animal proteins, milk, chicken, etc., increases significantly. And this is really part of the reason why when New Zealand got rid of their version of supply management, they became a dairy powerhouse. They're the supplier for a lot of Asian markets. They are. It is big business in New Zealand, not because they constantly have the ear of their government for protection, and are the most powerful lobby group in the country. It's big business because they are selling to the world. And that is an opportunity that we have if we were to get rid of supply management, is that rather than just being focused on the domestic market, we could actually focus on accessing international markets. And then obviously on the Canadian consumer side, yeah, it would be great to have more competition for those core staple items to bring prices down, to have some variation. And it isn't just it isn't just a question about American products. It's a question about European and French cheeses. It's a question about Irish Kerrygold butter. All of those other products that we would love to have better access to, which we can't, simply because anytime one of those countries goes over the very small amount of the market that we allow them to have access to, the tariffs range from 150 to 300%.
Let's talk a bit more about interprovincial trade. And this is one area where all this trade drama has, I think, kind of been a wake up call for Canada and how we can
Yep.
improve internal trade and all these trade barriers that have built up over the years. I think we've taken some steps in the right direction. We saw another baby step this week with an agreement on interprovincial alcohol sales. Are we serious yet, David, in really finally addressing these internal trade barriers?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, the alcohol announcement is good news in theory. But there is still the big question of the provincial markup. And this is where the entire wholesale system of alcohol distribution in Canada is just so fundamentally flawed. The quickest way I can explain this is that in every province, the provincial wholesaler, the Crown Corporation, is the only wholesale buyer of alcohol. And that's the only way private businesses can purchase alcohol. So in Alberta, any private liquor store is buying it through the Albertan provincial wholesaler. In Ontario, depending on the product, if it's spirits, it's provincial wholesaler, provincially owned retailer. If it's wine or beer, now it's been liberalized under Doug Ford, which is a step in the right direction. But these liquor boards want their markup. And so uh, that in itself is almost acting as a tariff on a good coming from another province. And this is where Canada, in its kind of fractionalized um, nature, where we've had provinces forever essentially behaving like little countries, wanting to protect their piece of the revenue pie, their whatever industry or professional association that has their ear. And so we are making steps. It is incredibly slow. And even on this alcohol announcement, which is in theory good news, it will be entirely gummed up if the liquor boards and the finance departments in each province are going to put their foot down and say, even though it's going directly from a winery in Kelowna to a consumer in Toronto, that the LCBO in Ontario wants its cut. And that question has still yet to be fully answered, I think. There's a very easy solution to fix it, but I'm not sure there's much political appetite provincially to go ahead and actually enact what would be a very simple fix.
Yeah, and by the way, and Quebec's not a part of that agreement either, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate. But yes, on the surface, it looks good. Like this is bypassing all of that red tape in theory, directly from the producer to the consumer. But the devil's going to be in the details, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. What I wish on the alcohol front, what would solve this overnight, is if any single province, rather than being the wholesaler of alcohol at all, just applied the tax at the point of retail. That would solve the problem entirely, because the purchaser would pay the tax, and yes, it would be high, but at least it would be transparent, because right now the taxes, markups, and fees are obscured by the wholesale process, so the consumer doesn't actually see how much the government take is on a bottle of wine. It's about, let's say, 50%. So yeah, it would suck. You'd see the tax. I think that's a little more honest with consumers, but it would completely dissolve all of the questions or issues regarding interprovincial trade when it comes to alcohol, because the tax would just be at the point of sale, and that would negate all of the shenanigans around the liquor board saying who wants control and who doesn't. I mean, it would have also negated. It would have negated the ability for provinces to ban U.S. alcohol as well, which I don't think the provinces should have ever done. We should have left Canadians to decide whether or not they want to buy U.S. alcohol, just like we leave it to Canadians to decide if they still want to go vacation in the United States. And in many instances, they don't. So it's really, for me, the liquor boards are the big holdup on this aspect of interprovincial free trade for alcohol, and it's going to take the liquor boards provincially and their respective finance departments in each province to just take a step back and let it actually be real producer to consumer retail, rather than trying to insert themselves to take their piece of the pie.
Mm-hmm. So in the meantime, David, and just to finish where we began, the clock is ticking, I guess, now just over 3 weeks before these new U.S. tariffs kick in. And we'll see what happens between now and then, both in terms of what happens on the U.S. side and how Canada responds. What's your level of optimism that common sense can still prevail here with everything going on, at least in the short term? How worried should we be moving forward?
I would say I'm still somewhat optimistic that a deal can get done. I think I'm more optimistic in the trade war falling apart in one of those steps that I otherwise outlined,
Yeah.
right? Court challenge, Congress retaking authority, Democrats winning the House, etc. Um, it really just depends on what the strategy is of the Carney government. What doesn't make me optimistic is this good cop, bad cop dynamic between the federal government and the provincial premiers. If it were me, if I was Mark Carney, I would be telling the premiers to stop talking to the press about this and say, you know what, we're going to let the prime minister and his team, we have faith in them, we're going to let them handle it. We're not going to get involved. Because this ununified approach is just poking the hornet's nest south of the border. And that isn't really helping us. I could understand why some people thought it might, but from what we've seen, using the alcohol ban as an example, or the ads that Doug Ford ran in the United States, didn't help. It did not help to have Carney put a complimentary, forward-looking face on in front of the president, and then at the same time have the premiers completely undercut that and talk about punching people in the nose and crippling and dismantling the U.S. economy. It has to be a Team Canada approach, and a Team Canada approach can't be Carney is the good guy and the premiers are going to play it tough.
Well, I'll be watching closely for sure. Much more, consumerchoicecenter.org. David, appreciate the insight and the overview of all of this. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Once again, that was David Clement. He's policy director with the Consumer Choice Center. Some interesting points on all of this, and we'll see how Canada chooses to respond moving forward. And it's interesting. David made the point about some of the competing voices in all of this. Ultimately, it's the Canadian government that has to make some decisions here. I think the Prime Minister wants to have a consensus with the premiers, to have a Team Canada approach, but premiers are looking out for their own interests and their own jurisdictions, and they don't always see eye to eye on these things, as I think we've come to understand. So you had some tough talk this week from Ontario Premier Doug Ford about retaliating against the United States. You've got Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith urging a more cautious approach, and once again saying that the idea of limiting or taxing oil exports to the U.S. should be completely off the table, which I would tend to agree with. So hopefully Canadian leaders are measured in how they respond to this and think about what the ultimate objective of any kind of response should be. What is it we're trying to achieve? There is still that nagging question, though, of even if we get a deal with Donald Trump, how much faith can we put in that? So I think that's a worrying shadow that's being cast over all of this. So that was one of the questions put to the Prime Minister at the close of this first minister's meeting, that what is on the table in terms of a possible Canadian response. And even in that best case scenario where the Americans sit down, we reach a deal, how much faith can we actually put in that?
You said this morning that all these governments would do whatever it takes to defend and support our families, our business, et cetera. And I'd like to hear after 3 hours of meeting, some specifics. Counter tariffs are a possibility, and so on, if you could provide some specifics. And then two, let's say you get this deal, CUSMA 2 with the President of the United States. You're going to have to convince a lot of Canadians skeptical of the trustworthiness of the President that no, this time he means it. He'll keep his word this time on CUSMA 2. How will you explain that the President can be trusted when he signs a document with your name on it? Thank you.
Well, first, in terms of doing whatever it takes, there's multiple aspects of that. First, and I won't repeat the whole element of, but it's building the economy and support. Like that's fundamental. It's diversifying our trade relations. It's all that. Secondly, it is helping those sectors that are affected directly by the tariffs with financial support, supporting their workers, reorienting demand for some of their products where that's possible, providing some level of trade protection, if necessary, remissions, other aspects. So there's a variety of things, and we're working through that. We've been doing this and supporting literally tens of thousands of jobs in the 232 sectors, the strategic sectors, steel, aluminum, automobiles, and others, and we'll continue to do that with other sectors that are affected. The third is responding. If these tariffs or other measures come into force, there's a full range of things that we can do in that regard. We don't need to respond in advance. In fact, I think it would be counterproductive at this stage to respond in advance. But it's important to know what your options are, to have worked it through, to have shared as it affects certain provinces or they have perspectives directly, and be united in that response. And I would say, and premiers obviously speak for themselves, we are united in direction and objective and purpose and seriousness about the response. We are going to support Canadian families, workers, businesses, full stop. Now, to the second part of your question, first, I have to be convinced, we have to be convinced, the team has to be convinced, the premiers have to be convinced that an agreement is worth the paper it's written on, and I think at the core of that is that the agreement recognizes the benefits, the very, very many benefits that trade with Canada brings, not just to Canadians, but to Americans. I mean, it's their self-interest. But it has to recognize, it has to be aligned, has to have provisions that reinforce, of course. But we will know when we see it. And I would say, we go in from Missouri, to use an American expression, on this. With wide eyes, lots of options, rolling up our sleeves, doing the work. We're working on behalf of Canadians, we'll know it when we see it. And final point, there are other things we could have done in the intervening time that we didn't do in agreements, perhaps because of the nature of your question.
And one more here from the Prime Minister on the question of this 30-day window. Now, the clock is ticking on these tariffs being imposed. Donald Trump saying they will be imposed after 30 days. Is this a 30-day window that gives us an opportunity to make a breakthrough in negotiations, or is it really just meant as a pressure tactic by the Americans?
Prime Minister, I'm wondering how you see this window of time of trade talks, given the new 30-day deadline. Do you think that this is a meaningful opportunity to approach some sort of end game with the United States, or is it just another pressure tactic from the Trump administration?
It's both. I mean, that's the direct answer. We've seen a series of trade negotiations that the U.S. has undertaken, and normally there's a deadline. Normally there's an outsized tariff associated with that deadline. First observation. The second thing is that I would say that in our interactions this week with various levels of the U.S. administration, mine with the President, Minister LeBlanc, with his counterpart, Madame Charette, with hers, other officials, that there's a level of engagement and a breadth of engagement that reflects the seriousness of the trade relationship and the breadth of the issues. So it creates an opportunity. Now, and I'm going to hand back to you, Kate, but I'll just say that First Ministers, Premiers, and myself, we've had a series of conversations on this, on what it means, what our priorities are, where we go from here. And I will say, give you two observations from that. One, we all recognize that the most important thing we can do is to continue to build this economy strong and unite this economy. That's job one. That immediate benefits for Canadians, and that is what we can control. And the second is to be united with respect to our strategy, our negotiating strategy, and our objectives. And part of that unity is recognizing that there isn't a series of little trade issues, they're broad trade issues. All of them have to be part of a comprehensive agreement.
Okay, so that was the Prime Minister speaking this week at the conclusion of the First Minister's meeting in Prince Edward Island. And obviously the tariffs, the trade drama, front and center, the Prime Minister being coy about Canada's next move here. And I think we need to be careful. We need to be careful about an escalation. We need to be careful about responses that are going to hurt Canadian consumers or hurt the Canadian economy. I think we also need to be mindful, though, of showing weakness here. And just rushing to make more concessions. And I think it's a legitimate criticism of this Prime Minister that we have made concessions to the Americans over the last year on a variety of issues and fronts, including most recently this deal to get the Gordie Howe International Bridge, the Windsor to Detroit crossing open. So I don't know if all of these concessions are necessarily helping Canada either. So it's a fine line. It's not an easy position, to be sure, for the Prime Minister, for Canadian leaders to be in trying to navigate all of this and trying to navigate Donald Trump, who is unpredictable, who is belligerent. But I guess one constant seems to be that he really likes tariffs, not just against Canada, as we see against other countries and against other trading partners. And that point about being able to trust Donald Trump, some of these other countries that Trump has reached trade deals with, or like the European Union, for example, he's already shown a willingness and a capacity to break or violate those agreements. So it's something else Canadian leaders need to be careful about. How much faith can we put in a new agreement with the Americans? Or why do we even need a new agreement in the first place, given that we already negotiated one with Donald Trump? So unfortunately, we're thrown back into all of this uncertainty, all of this trade drama, and perhaps even an escalating trade war. Let's hope that sanity and cooler heads can prevail, but at the same time, maybe don't hold your breath. So we'll continue to track this and follow this over the rest of the summer here. Clearly, this is now at the forefront of the Canadian conversation, and I think once again, weighing on Canadians. Hopefully, we're in a better position than we were when Trump was first back into office at the beginning of 2025. I know this government has tried to take some steps to increase our trade ties with other countries, to try to build up Canadian capacity and making some important steps forward on major projects like pipelines. But look, we got a long way to go on that front. That's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Again, thank you so much for joining us here this week. You can find us, of course, on our YouTube channel at Rob Breakenridge Show. You can find this podcast on audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music. And you can find us at our website, and we got a piece up as well on some of this latest trade drama, robbreakenridge.ca. Again, thanks for joining us here this week. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Have a terrific weekend, and we will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.